Hi, it's Jamie from Guildbrook Farm, and welcome to The Dirt. Think of The Dirt as a getting to know you session, and today I'd like to talk about why I'm choosing to homestead. I think understanding why somebody does something is just as important as understanding how they do something. And in order to explain to you why I'm choosing to homestead, I need to tell you a little story about my past. And this story is as much about my dad as it is about me, because he was a very big influence on my life, in particular when I was very small. I grew up in a very small town in the Allegheny Mountains of central Pennsylvania. There was only one road that ran through our town, and the nearest towns to us were 30 miles in either direction. We were basically nestled in a valley in the mountains. Now, my dad specifically chose this location because of its isolation and because of the hobbies that he enjoyed doing. It wasn't until much later that I realized what he enjoyed doing was homesteading. Now, I lived in a trailer up until I was about 3 years old, while my dad, who didn't really have much construction experience, actually got with another gentleman, a friend of his, and together they had built our house. After our house was built, we basically began homesteading. My dad taught me how to hunt and how to fish. We would gather wild blueberries in August. We gathered all of our firewood throughout the year that would supply all of our heat throughout the winter. And we would save milk jugs and take those up the mountains to springs. These were essentially a pipe that came out of the mountain, that someone tapped into the mountain to a spring, and we filled up our jugs, and that was our drinking water. Now, we weren't off-grid or anything. We did have electricity, but this was just the lifestyle that my dad had wanted to live. And actually, some of my fondest memories are of my childhood and just romping around the woods, chasing after my dad while he's marking deer trails. I'd be picking up tea berries off the ground and eating them, and parachuting from trees. That's where you crawl out on a tree limb and parachute to the ground. I really had a very, very good childhood, and I loved what we were doing. Although I didn't know that it was different from what anybody else was doing, at least not at the time. Now, an important point here is that my dad also owned his own business. He was an electrician, and eventually he went on to become a general contractor. And he was a one-man show. At one point he had another gentleman helping him, but for the most part he owned his own business, and he was the only person that ran that business, and he was essentially the sole provider for our family. Now, around middle school, things started to change for me. That's when, along with other kids, I started getting a lot of peer pressure from kids in school about the types of clothes that I was wearing, and why I wasn't wearing brand name clothes, and why I only had 2 pair of jeans. And so it started all of a sudden to become embarrassed of the lifestyle that I was living. This was coming from my peers, and it was also coming from some other people that didn't live in town, some older relatives, older cousins, just kind of pointing out how we were living, and it just became obvious that it was different from the way other people were living. And also around the same time, my dad really started struggling with his business. As you can only imagine, our town was very, very small, 3,000 people at the max, and to maintain a business like that was extremely difficult for him. He had to pay for all of our own health insurance and all of our bills, everything. He was responsible for that, and that became quite a burden around that point. And I remember how difficult it was for him, and me asking him, "Dad, well, why don't you just go live in the town 30 miles from here? It's a much larger town. I'm sure you get a lot more business." And he said, "Jamie, that's not where I want to live. That's not the life that I want to live. I want to live here. I want to be in the woods. This is where I need to be." I didn't quite understand that at the time, especially seeing how hard things were. But it definitely left a mark and an impression on me that money meant something. And so as I went through junior high, I went through high school, I started also getting a lot of other impressions about how important money was. And in particular, my family had wanted me to go off to college to make a lot of money. That was their goal for me. So that's what I did. I graduated from high school and I went on to college, and my family couldn't afford to put me through college, so I did put myself through college. I graduated in 3 years from a 4-year college, and I went off to the big world to get my job that would make me lots of money. So as I eventually ended up moving up and down the East Coast, and each time I moved I tried to get better and better jobs, and my whole goal was to reach this amount, and then once I reached that amount of money I would reach another amount. That was my next goal, to try and make this much money. And I started to place a value on myself based on how much money I could make. I thought that if I could make more money I would be happier. Because as a kid, I saw this discrepancy. I saw where my dad wasn't making a lot of money, and he seemed unhappy. I didn't quite understand that, but so I thought if I made more money, I would be happier. So I kept chasing this dream, and to the point where I finally maxed out on that salary, and I made as much money as I could possibly ever want to make. And when I got there, and this was several years ago, it took quite a lifetime to reach that amount, and a lot of work and a lot of hours. And I realized that the more money I was making, the less happier I was. You see, my childhood determined who I was. It basically established what my likes and dislikes were, and what I liked was being in the woods. I enjoyed living the homesteading lifestyle. So the further and further I got away from that, the more that I started climbing that corporate ladder and chasing that dream of having more money and socking money away in my 401k for my retirement at 65, I was getting less and less happy. I wasn't spending as much time with my children. And this all culminated to a breaking point where I said enough was enough. I was so unhappy with my life, and I was trying to figure out why I was so unhappy. So I did some meditation on it, and I realized that the happiest I'd ever been in my life was when I was a child, when I was living that homesteading lifestyle. So what I did is something that I don't recommend anybody does, and that is I severed the ties from money. I quit my job. I walked away. And this was a very big move for me because I consider myself to be a very loyal and a very responsible person. But at that point in my life, I felt that I had completely and totally lost myself. I didn't know who I was anymore. As you can see, I'm not very corporate. So I was the furthest away from being who I truly was. And the only way to ground myself, to center myself, was to just erase all ties with money and to get back to ground roots and start over. And so that's exactly what I did. And I got rid of all the materialistic things that I had gathered throughout the years. I pared everything down financially to bare minimum so that I could hold any job that I wanted to hold and not be stuck working in a cubicle and having to have a very high stressed job and having to appeal to that kind of job and what goes along with it. And that began my homesteading lifestyle. Now my dad has been deceased now for well over 15 years. He died of AML leukemia. But if he were here today, what I would tell him is, Dad, remember when you said that you weren't going to chase the money, you weren't going to move to the town 30 miles away to make more money, that this is what you wanted? I get that now. I understand. It's taken a long time, but Dad, I get it. I understand. And so that is why I am homesteading. And I have quite a bit of challenges here. I can't just drop everything and move to the mountains. I'm actually in a suburban neighborhood right now. It's actually becoming more and more suburban, I'd say every month. I have a lot of limitations on this property as to what I can and can't do, but I'm working the best that I can to live this homesteading lifestyle, and I think the most important part is that I am mentally in that homesteading space where I'm just living life day to day and living it simply. So that's why I'm homesteading. I hope that's been somewhat educational or inspirational to you. If you guys are thinking about homesteading, or if you have been homesteading for a while now, leave a comment below. I'd like to hear as to why you are choosing to homestead or why you're thinking about it. Thanks for watching.